starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to our Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning webinar. My name is Rosie Patterson and I'm moderating this session. We have the usual functions for our audience to use. Please type your questions into the question box and we'd love to have your input. We have a very large audience today, in fact a record number. So if you don't get your question asked, please don't be disappointed. We will give you the contact details of the key people in the end, and we may even go slightly over the hour. And so for anyone who needs to leave, keep in mind that you can access the recording later. Now, before I get started, I'll introduce Blair Turner, who alerted me to the fact that we Australians had to hear about our presenters' work. So welcome, Blair. How are you?
Hi, Rosemary. I'm great. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of our listeners.
Awesome. And we have Lisa Stone-Metz, who is helping out with fielding the questions and a valuable asset with us today. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Rosemary.
And Blair, can you tell us about how you found out what Dr. Zdeněk Spirat was doing in Europe?
Yeah, so we've had a long-standing relationship with the Transport Research Centre in the Czech Republic. In fact, we've had previous exchange programs. Other members of staff have come out to join us here in Australia and also been involved in collaboration. And so when we heard about Zdeněk's interest area and his research background on these topics, we were very, very keen to bring him here to Australia. And it's really because we're aware of the growing interest from Australia and New Zealand road agencies, both at state and local level, but also the consultancy as well in this area around sustainable urban mobility planning and cycling provision as well. And we're certainly aware there's some fantastic case studies here in Australia and New Zealand and some innovative thinking, but at the same time we're very aware of some of the direction from North America and from Europe. And we've been involved in projects and working with stakeholder partners in both parts of the world. But as a national research organisation, we're very keen to move knowledge forward in this area here in Australia as well. So we were very, very happy when Zdeněk got in touch and mentioned his interest to come to Australia. And while he was here, we managed to visit various road agencies, and he was here for a 2-month period late last year. And I guess just to preempt a couple of the slides that we'll see today, we were very, very impressed, particularly with the SUMP process, and that will become clear as part of this presentation, and also this the CiviNet network in Europe, and how that's been set up to support sustainable urban mobility planning. And I guess one of the major outcomes we're looking for today is to explore whether there's a similar approach that could be adopted here in Australia, and certainly whether there's any interest in developing a network of people who are interested in this sort of a topic. And so very keen to hear feedback from users during this presentation and afterwards.
Great work, Blair, getting this valuable webinar happening today. And we're so lucky to have this chance to find out what is happening overseas. And Zdeněk is an experienced researcher in urban mobility issues, and I've popped his awesome bio on our webinar handout panel for anyone who wants to learn more about the work he has done and is doing. So welcome, Zdeněk. Thank you so much for getting up early in the morning in the Czech Republic. And I see you have some slides on your impressions of Australia. I'm really looking forward to that part as well. Welcome to you, and let's get started.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Blair, for introducing me. Good afternoon to Australia. Good afternoon from frozen morning in the Czech Republic. We have beautiful winter here, as you can see at the photo I took 2 days ago in Czech mountains when I was doing cross-country skiing. To today's presentation, as told my background, I do research and consultancy in urban mobility planning. I do advisory on SUMP process for Ministry of Transportation, and I'm quite active at EU level in sharing experience and in international methodologies and so on. Originally, I am designer of bicycle transport infrastructure, and I did a lot of work in bicycle strategies and used my studies in the Netherlands, and I will mention all parts of my work, so you will have some clear image about what the situation is in Europe. I'm very happy for this opportunity and to share my experience. You can see table of contents, and I will start with state of the art of urban mobility in EU, about some context information. I'm sure you are aware about some differences between Australia cities and cities in New Zealand compared to European cities. Long history of cities development, quite limited historical centers with limited space, but also culture and political and economic factors which were very important before political changes in 1980s, and we are still observing their impacts until today. Also different planning, development, and so on. And maybe the last point, importance of public transport and or cycling tradition, which seems quite big, important factor when we want to do some improvement on change in public transport or cycling. I will start with some graphs, and one of them is modal split as one of the most important parameter, which is describing the, let's say, how the city is moving towards sustainability in terms of transport. Modal split is one of the most frequently used indicator used for comparison of the mobility between cities and development of the city during time. It shows a share of trips, not the distance traveled, and data comes from household surveys. As you can see, in different European cities, the modal split differs quite a lot. Important is the bottom part of the columns, red in a red color, the share of car use. You can see, for example, differences between city of Delft in the Netherlands, which is very famous for its cycling volumes. I will mention it later in my presentation, with 34% of trips done by bicycle, and city of Zurich, which has nearly the same share of car trips, but the share of public transport is much higher than in Delft. Regarding the minimum of car trips, so we have cities mainly in Denmark and in the Netherlands which have 20 or 25% of trips done by car. At the other side, we have some cities in, for example, Cyprus, Nicosia, reaching 80% of car trips. I put here one screen which is showing the situation in Australia from two sources. You can see that the share of car trips is much higher than in Europe. In Austrian level, around 80% of all urban trips are done by car, and you can also compare three biggest cities, Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane, how they are doing regarding modal share. We can move forward, and I would like to show you now the comparison between selected German cities and some Central European towns, which are at the right side of the screen. There are groups of cities are divided into groups according to the number of inhabitants, and you can see here that the bigger the city is, the lower share of car use is recorded there. It's caused by usually higher density of the city and higher quality of public transport than in smaller cities between 50 to 100,000 inhabitants. But what is also important here that there is in bigger cities much higher share of single-person households, which can easily exist without car ownership and car use. Here at the right side, you can see Central and Eastern European cities, which are, except for Gdańsk in Poland, they are quite smaller. between 50 to 100,000 inhabitants, and you can see that the share of car use is even lower than in German cities. I will comment it why is it later. Okay, that was how it is today, but when we look into detail into one city, the city of Leipzig in Germany, we can see how the modal spread was developed during the time. Since 1970s, you can see that car use was pretty low with high share of public transport use, and then it was growing until 2003, when was the peak, and since then car use again is decreasing. It's quite interesting to see how the share of public transport is decreasing, and competition between public transport and cycling is occurring last year. It's quite a problem, and we try to find solution how to prevent this, we say, cannibalism of sustainable modes of transport. I would like to add that, for example, in Prague, the capital of Czech Republic, in late 1980s, we reached 80% of trips were done by public transport. Today, it's 43, as you saw in previous slide. Maybe one stop at a typical Central European city, which is probably around 100,000 inhabitants. What is its characteristic is quite intensive increase of share of children brought to school by cars, and at the same time decrease of public transport passengers, and slight decrease of inhabitants caused by suburbanization and moving people behind the city borders to small villages, to their family houses, which is quite problematic to operate by public transport. Also, aging is quite a problem in city of this size. And so, yeah, this is how typical Central European city is working. To summarize the state of the art of European mobility, there are considerable differences across Europe, and we cannot say that this is typical European. North-south, from north to south, from east to west, for example, we cannot compare regarding mobility Italy with Denmark or with the Netherlands. But what we can see mostly in Eastern European countries that still predict and provide approach is on the table, so that the cities try to estimate the future volumes of traffic and accommodate the traffic infrastructure to these numbers. Oppositely, active transport policy, typical for today, typical for Western and some of Central European cities, which try to set some vision and more actively manage the mobility. A higher share of public transport until 1990s, then increase of car use. Yeah, it was described in the previous graph in Western cities. As I told you, the golden age of car use is mostly over. Historically, they have lower public transport share, but it's increasing. It's still lower than in Eastern cities. Yeah, perspective changed a lot since 1980s, and I think that Margaret Thatcher would not succeed with this statement today. Today, young people mostly in Western cities, in Germany, in Switzerland, and so on, they do not need to possess a car. Okay, this was a history, but look into present and future now. I would like to introduce you the, let's say, new common approach for European cities, which which is called the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan, which is a strategic plan to satisfy the mobility needs in cities for a better quality of life, and it builds on existing planning practice and intensively working with integration, public participation, and evaluation principles. It was based on a good experience with urban mobility planning in France and in Flanders in Belgium or in England from 1990s. Today it's, let's say, compulsory, and it's bounded in law in France, for example, for all agglomerations over 100,000 inhabitants, and also in Flanders, it's regulated by law. So EU collected the good experience and decided to develop common EU guidelines for SUMP. You can see the main, let's say, characteristic: providing access, safety, security, dealing with emissions and noise, improving efficiency and cost effectiveness, and also focus on attractiveness and quality of the urban environment. Today, well, SUMP process respects all strategic materials of European Commission, and it is really strongly supported across the whole EU. It's on the it's a key focus of interest in founding programs Horizon 2020, and all, let's say, all programs dealing with know-how transfer and improving knowledge are somehow connected with SUMP. They are about urban mobility. All EU countries had possibility to be involved through EU projects. So-called national focal points were created to disseminate the information and knowledge from EU level to EU countries. Also, national ministries are involved through specific projects. I will mention two of them later. And this is the planning circle, the system or the process, how the process is going. It starts from statement, starting point. Here we want to improve mobility and quality of life for our citizens. The commitment at the beginning of the process, which has 4 phases: preparing well, goal setting, elaborating the plan, and its implementation. What are the main, let's say, characteristics or are long-term vision, objectives, targets, and measures? So we no more follow the trends, no more accommodate traffic infrastructure to expected volumes or to prognose volumes of cars, but try to set the vision for 20 years in the future and try to meet it through measures, targets, and goals. Interdisciplinarity, which means involvement of topics like health, environment, education. All of these have something to do with urban mobility. Public and stakeholder participation is really core process, and its main characteristic, which is strongly accented by European Commission. Integration of modes, integration of planning. It means that passenger traveler decides, and we try to influence his decision. So we do not have 4 categories of cyclists, pedestrians, car users, and so on, but we try to look at the passenger from his perspective and why he is choosing the mode of transport that he chooses. Assessment of current and future performance. Again, it's about models and modeling the development scenarios. We usually try to estimate how the mobility in target years in 20 years in future will look like, and try to estimate its wider effects on mobility, on air pollution, and so on. Monitoring, evaluation, and improvement. Of course, the process it has to respect national processes or national legislation, so it has to be accommodated to national conditions, and it's improved after each circle is done. Well, the period is probably 5 years. City of Prague or City of Dresden in Germany, they did this process in 5 years. So it goes through election period, and mainly the public involvement is the reason for this long term of elaboration. And in this slide, you can see in which steps the public is involved, where the core participation parts or milestones of the process. For example, we realize that participation is really, public participation is a really important factor, and we need it. Because we faced the big problems, for example, when we prepare designs of street reconstruction and we announced to the public that there are 2 versions of the table and wanted their approval for one of them. But people, mainly citizens of the streets, they refused both, and petitions stopped the preparation of the intention. So the reason was that we didn't involve the citizens to planning process from early beginning. Okay, now maybe there is time for some questions, if there are any. Are there any questions? No. So we can continue. I have shown you Margaret Thatcher's statement describing her attitude to public transport, and I would like to show you some example of survey which was done in city of Leipzig in Germany I was speaking about. And there was a question, what citizens stated as their priorities. 95% of citizens in Leipzig preferred public transport before cars. What politicians and authorities thought how their citizens would prioritize public transport and cars? The results were quite different, as you can see. The final question was what citizens thought how their politicians and authorities will prioritize public transport and car. You can see that there were really differences between citizens' statement and what they thought that politicians and authorities will prioritize, but still the majority was in public transport. What really differs from politicians and authorities' point of view. So this is just the question whether politicians really understand what what citizens prefer. Interesting result from interesting survey from City of Leipzig. And this is one the case of really successful city of Zurich in Switzerland, which is really the biggest Swiss city, very famous and rich. In 2000, they had 40% of trips done by car, which fall to 30% in 2010. Year after, there was a referendum about how the traffic, how much traffic should be allowed in city center, and citizens voted for more strict parking policy, which was transferred to city plan, which goal was to reach 20% of car trips by the year 2025, which is extremely ambitious. And also municipal staff in the city of Zurich were a little bit afraid whether this goal is reachable. But you can see that 4 years later, they did already quite a good progress. Here, the similar ambitious in the capital of Austria, city of Vienna. Again, you can see the modal split in 1993 with 40% of trips done by car compared to significant decrease in 2015, 27%, and the ambition is to reach 20% by 2025. Here is example of city of Freiburg in Germany, the borders, very close to borders with France. It's really famous city in European context because of its green policy, not only transport policy, but also energetic policy and energy consumption. And the main goal of transport policy is to avoid traffic. So all destinations in city are reachable by walk, and 70% of inhabitants live up to 500 meters from tram stops. On the map, you can see the speed limits. For example, yellow streets, yellow roads are in the limit 50 or higher, 50 or more kilometers per hour, and all the rest of the city is 30 kilometers per hour zones, or even lower, street for children. And there is one really famous district in this city of Freiburg, and it's Vauban. It's a newly built district designed for living without cars. There is car ownership in this district is only 150 cars per 1,000 inhabitants. And at the same time, the share of children is the highest in Germany in the district. So it means that also families with children can easily live without cars. 2 parking houses are built in this district, so the inhabitants cannot park on street, and park places in park houses is not for free, of course. And yeah, the quality of life is really really high, and the flats are really expensive there. I spoke about cities or streets for children. I realized that in Australia, this traffic sign, for example, is not used. So just one short stop to introduce it. We call it residential zone, with its characteristic like maximum speed 20 kilometers per hour, no sidewalks, and children can play on the road. Parking only allowed at market park places. And there are some regulations. The driver must not endanger pedestrians. If necessary, has to stop, but at the same time, pedestrians and all people have to allow car drivers to drive through. And another example is from, maybe you know already this case. City of Houten in the Netherlands is famous for its really high cycling share and a good cycling infrastructure, which is the city which in 1960s it was a small village with 3,000 inhabitants, and there was a new development plan to upgrade it to the city of 50,000 inhabitants. And it was designed upside down, that the infrastructure for cars, it's around the city, and infrastructure for cyclists is in the city. So if you want to go from one house to another, the travel time by bike is really shorter than by car. All houses are accessible by car, so the car ownership is not much lower than in other Dutch cities, but the usage of cars is much smaller. And last example is the theoretical concept from the Swedish city of Örebro. They developed their so-called four-step planning approach. You can imagine that we have some busy junction between city center and suburbs, which is out of its capacity during morning peak hours. And so at the first step, they try to influence the actual need for travel, for transport or transportation, which means that, for example, you look into detail to parking policy in city center and assess if you somehow change parking capacities or parking fees, if it can help you to solve the situation. And second step, if the first one doesn't work, is that the traffic that already exists there must be made more efficient. So you try to, for example, introduce dedicated lanes for buses and so on. So third step, existing infrastructure must be improved, additional lanes for public transport and or cycling infrastructure, and only at the last step, new infrastructure must be built. Yeah, it's theory, but it helps us when we are trying to convince stakeholders and to influence their perspective to the traffic problem, to help it helps us to bring another different point of view to and come with a holistic approach which is needed when you are dealing with problems like this. The picture shows cyclists in winter riding on snow, which is quite usual in Scandinavian countries. 75 Danish people cycle also during winter time, and maintenance of cycling infrastructure is really important, because if they do not clean the cycleways, cyclists ride on lanes for cars and cause danger situation and traffic problems. Okay, before I move forward, there are some questions.
There are some questions, Banyak. So, in fact, literally dozens of questions have come through, and all of them are very interesting. I'd like to know the answer to many of these myself. But the first one here is about public transport. And so the question is, how do we motivate the public to actually use public transport more? And I guess that's a big challenge for transport planners. Do you have any advice from your experience in terms of getting people to use public transport more?
Yeah. It's a good question, and it differs. For example, in big cities where is problem with parking, where it's problem with traffic jam, it's much easier to get people to use public transport. For example, in Prague, it's much faster to go to the city by public transport than go by car. It's a problem in smaller cities, like 100,000 inhabitants, where the public transport is not competitive to car because of travel time. There is not a problem with parking, and the travel time of public transport is longer than by car. So this is really this problem, and we realize that when we promote public transport in these smaller cities, we often compete between cycling and public transport and not taking car drivers out of their cars.
There's quite a few questions around public transport. That's a great response. Another one that's come through, I guess, in a similar theme is just looking at the data. Can you draw the conclusion that as wealth increases in a city or a country, I guess, does the use of public transport decrease? Is that something that you think is a trend?
Once more, please. If increase.
Yes, as wealth increases, as people perhaps have more income, do you see
well, I showed the case of city of Zurich, which is really really expensive city with a lot of wealthy people, and the share of public transport is increasing. And yeah, it's about, I think it's about general transport policy, parking policy, and general attitude to travel behavior of citizens. For example, children in Switzerland are motivated to walk to school alone, and so yeah, it has wider consequences and wider context. From education to carrot and stick approach, and yeah, at the Zurich case, we can see that even in really rich cities, there is no problem with decrease in public transport.
Okay. Thanks, Benik. We'll move on. There's certainly a chance for more questions a little bit later on, so you please continue.
Okay, thank you. Now we will move to some examples of EU projects and EU networks, city networks, which are promoting sustainable urban mobility. The first one, what I would like to introduce is so-called CityNets. CityNet of Cities Vitality Networks, networks of cities interested in SUMP. This is quite intensively supported by EU because it offers knowledge exchange, conferences, seminars, mutual learning between countries, and excursions, site visits, and so on. Networks were established under Civitas platform, City Vitality Sustainability. And on the map, you can see how the CityNets are spreading, and it's quite successful concept, which allows us to get a lot of information from abroad. CityNets are a legal entity. They have regular members. These are cities and associated members like organizations active in urban mobility or research. Another example is what I would like to show is the Prosperity Project, which is one of the most ambitious projects in EU currently running. And its goal is to develop national SUMP programs, some strategies how to promote SUMPs at national level. And it's strongly focused on encouraging an involvement of national ministries into the process. So the ministries are responsible for increasing the SUMPs and their quality, and this project enables this. In Czech Republic, we created so-called Prosperity Task Force, which consists of Ministry of Transportation, And we have also invited Ministry of Regional Development, which is responsible for laws and legislation related to cities, building permits, and so on. Ministry of Health, because of impacts of active modes of transport to its health benefits. Ministry of Environment, because of air pollution, noise pollution, and so on. Ministry of Education, Youth and Sports, because they can influence the travel behavior of children. And also our organization, CDV, is involved, and Czech and Slovak Civinet, Model City. So this is the first example of the promotion from EU level, and the second one is an example of so-called traffic snake game, which motivates people for travel behavior, and it's quite useful concept. Here I put some results of it. It's played during 2 weeks period, usually during European Mobility Week, which is in September. Children put the dots on a banner of a snake, and each day there was a survey, hands up survey, to monitor the mode of transport, and children receive a reward when they do not come to school by car. So you can see the statistic before, during, and after 2 weeks period of this game. And one last thing in this topic is again something from Zurich, Switzerland, and it's about institutional mobility plan, which is mobility plan. For example, in France, it's compulsory for institutions over 100 employees, which is plan managing and trying to influence the travel behavior of employees or visitors, customers of shopping centers, and so on. You can see Seal City Shopping Mall with more than 2,000 employees. The developer was set the limit of incoming cars. 5 years after opening the shopping mall, 8,000 cars were allowed during daytime, 1,300 during nighttime, and 800 per peak hour. If it was exceeded, investor has to pay penalty, which really happened. And there's paid parking and no free parking for employees. Of course, investor or developer had to build up and support building transport at the shopping mall. The result is that only 30% of customers come by cars. At the picture here, you can see electric bicycles with trolleys. You can come with your shopping to the stand, and your shopping is delivered on time at selected address. You can do your shopping in a lunch break, for example, without any car, and they will deliver your shopping using this e-bike trailer to your home. Okay. Again, we have some closing remarks to close this part of presentation. Well, to conclude, urban traffic is really cross-sectional issue, and we cannot solve it separately. We need to consider wider impacts of traffic and to look at it from a higher perspective. There is really close interaction between land use planning and mode choice and density of cities. On the graphs which I showed at the beginning, you saw differences in modal split in European cities and Australian cities, and land use planning and the density of cities is one of the factor which has very strong influence. For example, if the city is really of low density, the introduction of public transport is quite difficult. Holistic, goal-oriented approach is needed. I presented that SUMP process start from the vision, and you have some really some clear vision to follow. Integrated horizontal and vertical perspective, horizontal including all responsible ministries, and vertical from transferring the knowledge from national level through regions to municipalities and so on. Public and stakeholder participation is the key for success, and prevent competition between active mode of transport. It's a challenge. It's easy to say, but quite difficult to realize. Okay, now we will move to cycling part of the presentation. Are there any questions, Blair?
Yes, there certainly are. Again, there's lots and lots of questions, Zbigniew, and there's quite a few on cycling, so we'll hold those until after you have presented the material on cycling. But just to summarise perhaps a flavour of some of the questions, a lot of people are sending information through on their experience. They're asking lots of questions. And so the question, I guess, that comes to my mind, and has been asked by people as well, is what's the potential for this sort of a network in a place like Australia? So a Civinet, for instance, in Australia, and do you think that's a useful thing? And how do we start this?
Yeah. It's quite a difficult question. Well, maybe at the first step, is there some awareness of sustainable urban mobility principles among cities, and try to get cities which are already aware of the problem? And if there are some existing network which already today which has similar focus, for example, in EU we have associations of healthy cities or bicycle city networks. You can join this network and widen their field of interest to mobility. Of course, you can start to promote the topic of sustainable mobility among stakeholders and its responsible ministry to find out whether they are interested, and what if there could be some support from national level. Yeah.
Okay. Like I said, there's lots more questions. So what we might do is continue on. So those that do need to finish at 4 o'clock can leave. So we'll hold off more questions until the end. But yeah, so please continue, and we'll try to address further questions at the end.
Okay. So now I will have to speed up. Bicycle transport. Yeah. A lot was mentioned in previous section. Cycling is my hobby, as I told you in the beginning. I'm originally a designer of cycling infrastructure, and so I would like to share some information I got during my stay in the Netherlands. You can see importance the bicycle transport, how it was before the Second World War in European cities. It was really the main mode of transport. Then after boom of cars, there was really significant decrease, but now it's ground again. Regarding importance or kilometers cycled per person per year, again, the Netherlands and Denmark are too far away in front of other countries. There is indirect relation between kilometers cycled and cyclists killed per the distance they cycle. So the more cycling, the safer for the safer situation for cyclists. Safety in numbers. Right-hand side, you can see the result of Danish study done in 47 Danish cities, which confirm the same. When we look to road casualties, it confirms, the statistic confirms previous graph, and compare, for example, Czech Republic with the Netherlands. You can see the number of inhabitants and road casualties. Interesting is that number of casualties between cyclists in the Netherlands is higher than killed car users. And when we compare, for example, the number of killed cyclists per distance cycled and specific locations on transport infrastructure, here you can see big differences between Czech Republic, which still suffers lack of infrastructure for cyclists, maybe outside, mostly outside of the cities, and as an alternative for busy roads, and how cycling is safe 10 times safer in, for example, if you are in the Netherlands going from one village to another. Here is the case of city of Delft in the Netherlands, very famous for its cycling infrastructure, which has the same hierarchy as the road network in other common cities, which means that they have so-called city level of bicycle network, with main requirement to provide capacity and high speed of cyclists with priorities at junction and at crossing. District level with this spacing, with main requirements to provide interconnection, and it refers to, this picture refers to city level infrastructure. This one is the district level example, and neighborhood level, which is connecting the parts of cycling infrastructure and specific houses, provide access to households. Okay, there are some other infrastructure things, but we are a little bit out of time, so I will skip this and do just one stop here to comment that the situation differs a lot regarding legislation for cycling. And here is example from the Czech Republic, which is describing the differences between on-road cycling and off-road cycling, and what is its impact on priorities at junction and attractiveness for cyclists. So if the infrastructure is not designed from cyclist perspective and it's not attractive for him, he often refuses to use it and continues to cycle on the road. It has to be taken into account. And here, last two slides regarding cycling in Europe. Case of Germany. You can see here it used to be a off-road cycleway in a suburb built in 1990s. It didn't work well because the cyclists riding in this infrastructure were hidden behind parked cars, and they were not visible for car drivers. And so it was danger for them. So they changed it and canceled this cycle path and planted the trees here. Now cyclists are using the same road with cars, which was introduced as a 30 km/h zone, and it's more convenient and safer for all car drivers and cyclists. And another example is current policy of the city of Dresden. Here it used to be crossing for cyclists, which led cyclists to the pedestrian to the sidewalk. Again, there was problem with danger situation and mixing of cyclists and pedestrians. So they started new solutions which keep cyclists on road and provide them more comfort and lower travel time. Okay, again, questions, if there are some questions for cycling, and then I will move to the final section.
Yeah, great. That's very interesting material, Spanjak, and certainly there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions around cycling and cycling safety, but I'll go first to a question from Robert. I think Robert was the first person to send a question through, and he's interested in the use of public transport by cyclists to link transport and I guess to extend the length of journeys that could be undertaken by cyclists. Is there much work that you are involved in regards to linking cycling and public transport?
Yeah. It's a tricky question, and we still do not have some common approach here. Some cities really try to allow cyclists in vehicles. Somewhere it's problem. For example, in smaller cities, there is it depends on public transport provider. It's possible to get to the bus or tram with your bicycle somewhere. It's problem. What we realized that in bigger cities, it's quite advantage of or good experience we have with park and bike facilities. Bike and ride facilities that at the main public transport stops you have parking infrastructure for bicycles, and so you can easily come by bike to the bus stop or tram stop or the metro station and continue by public transport. But I am not aware about some general some studies describing this
it sounds
problem.
perhaps there's a gap in knowledge there, Spanjak, that perhaps that's an area we need to do some more work on, because there seems to be a growing interest in that subject. There's a second question on cycling, and it's about, I guess, the safety issues again. So with a shift to cycling policies, so encouraging more cycling, do we need to consider the safety? And I think you've shown a few slides on that issue already. But yeah, so the question, with a shift in cycling policy, encouraging more cycling, would you need to consider the impact of cycling safety?
There were some studies done in some countries. Some results of them are that the more cyclists on roads mean that car drivers are more familiar with them, and so it may result in higher safety for cyclists. But as I showed on the graphs during my presentation, there is indirect relation between volumes of cycling and the traffic safety.
Perhaps that's related to the infrastructure that's provided. So where there's higher numbers of cyclists, perhaps those cities have put better facilities in place. Would that be true?
Yeah. Definitely.
Okay. We'll let you carry on with your last few slides, Spanjak, and hopefully people can stay with us to the end and some final questions at the end.
Okay. Thank you. So I will finish with my impression. I was asked to provide, I was asked by my colleagues to share my impression from Australia and maybe possibility to draw some recommendation. At the beginning, I have to say that I spent only 2 months, mostly in Melbourne, 1 week in Sydney and Brisbane, and so I am not deeply oriented in the mobility planning processes and other circumstances. I just provide here the first ideas which came to my mind. Of course, I enjoyed the Australia, beautiful country. From the transport perspective, and as I was coming from Europe, it was too much, the cities were too much car oriented, and I was quite surprised when I realized that, for example, in Brisbane, tramways were removed to get space for cars, and the most attractive space, the riverside, was given to roads, which is quite pity. And from from pedestrian perspective, somewhere I found solutions which were not too much familiar to pedestrians, which for them to cross junction 3 times, and while I didn't feel that in some cases as a pedestrian have the same priority as car driver. To give you my feedback, well, I think that it should be really useful to start some wider public discussion on quality of life and future vision of the cities. Of course, detailed surveys on travel behavior are needed for this. You already have some which I presented for 3 biggest cities. But also the desired travel behavior should be useful to survey or to monitor. At the first step, to focus on district or city which has greatest potential and citizens or stakeholders are already convinced and are aware of wider impacts of traffic. And this city can be used as a model case, and from Europe, we know that it really works well if you have something to show. And yeah, these are good examples. There's great potential for improvement of cycling, definitely. There is maybe more preference for public transport. Somewhere buses should be given more priority. Because if we keep people on their bicycles in buses and keep walking, they will save a lot of space, which can be used for motor traffic. And the question should be, what would happen if public transport users and cyclists change to the cars and become car drivers? Then the cities would face a great problem. So, yeah. Thank you very much. This was the last slide of my presentation. I am not sure if there are still some more questions. If not, I'm very happy. Yeah. Blair?
Yeah, there's certainly many questions, and I do need to apologise to people. There are so many we just can't ask them all. I will ask one question, and it's one that's come from others as well, but also one that I raised at the start. And that's really around sustainable urban mobility planning and cycling provision. Where do we start? And I must admit, I'm very taken by the SUMP approach in Europe. I think that would be of benefit to people in Australia and New Zealand. There's also other people listening to this from other countries around the world, including India, who've asked similar questions. Do these policies work in other places outside Europe? And I believe the answer is yes. So my question is, again, how do we get started with perhaps adopting a network or a SUMP type approach? Is it simply just a matter of us forming a network in Australia, perhaps downloading that material that you referenced earlier from the EU and just making a start? Do you have any, I guess, any advice about how to start?
Yeah. Again, quite difficult question and a complex question. I think that you should start to discuss the topic, whether there is support for this way of planning between key stakeholders. I mean, city representatives, between ministries, to get some ministry support. And it's really key to get this, because we realize that if the SUMP at the city doesn't have its politician, who is really the face of the process and the face of the SUMP, it usually doesn't work. So some driver, some key politician who will be responsible for SUMP is needed. And it could be fine to convince or to find some person like this, and it would be much easier to start with the process. Anyway, I think that there's a lot of inspiration from Europe, a lot of examples, and if I don't know there will be possibility, I will be very happy to help you with starting this process.
Well, that'd be great. I think would certainly benefit from the experience that you've got, Zbigniew. And I think for those who are interested, there's the contact details here for both Zbigniew and for myself. And we certainly are interested in hearing from people who would like to be part of this sort of a movement. And I think, Rosemary, the attendees can actually send a note to us to tell us if they're interested, and they can they raise their hand? I think it's the technical ability on the webinar to do that.
Yes, there is a function to raise your hand, and you could also just type yes into the question box, and we'll collect all those yeses. That might be better if people could do that. Thanks, Blair.
Great. Look, I'll just wrap up and then I'll pass back to Rosemary. I'd just like to really thank Zbigniew. It's a very early morning there in Europe. It was a great pleasure to have you here in Australia with us, and certainly a pleasure to hear from you again today. The information you provided will be of huge benefit, I think, here to our audience. And I'd like to pass on a virtual round of applause for all the great information you provided. So thank you, and I'll pass back to Rosemary.
Thank you, everyone, and I'll send a link to the recording and a copy of the PDF. And our next webinar is coming up on the 21st of February. I'll send you a link to that in case you are interested in registering. It is about changing how we change, overcoming resistance to introducing new policies. And the presenter is Daniel Abbas, who is Director responsible for Technology Innovation at Future Eye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.